Order, please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start questioning for today by tabling the Nova Scotia Sustainable Procurement Policy, which guides government purchases. The policy states, and I quote, "This policy is designed to drive best value for the expenditure of public funds through maximizing competition and conducting open, fair, and transparent purchasing processes," and I'll table that for the benefit of the House. Mr. Speaker, this is a policy that is put in place to protect taxpayers from bad deals, like a government that pays 12 times the assessed value when it's buying land. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier if he can tell the House what steps did his government take to ensure that the purchase of the Whopper Drop lands in Bayers Lake followed their own purchasing policy?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. As I said to him yesterday, our generation has an opportunity to reshape the healthcare delivery model in the province. Very excited about the fact that the outpatient clinic will be happening out where the majority of the citizens are in HRN that would be using that facility, as well as it's in a location where the 60% of us who live outside of HRM who come in to access those facilities will have easier access to it. I told him yesterday the Department of Transportation went around, looked at the number of sites that were in the area, looked at the roads coming in, what it would cost to get those sites set up. The honourable member is referring to an assessment on a property that was woodland that had no work done to it at all. The price, though, that he's using that we bought it for is a fully accessible site, one that has water, sewer, roads. The pad is ready for building, Mr. Speaker, and we're excited about the fact that Nova Scotians are joining our government to continue to move forward to improve the healthcare system in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what Nova Scotians are doing is questioning the integrity of the Premier's government because they see an untendered land purchase at 12 times its assessed value and a government leader who won't share why that was done, how they came to that purchase price, why they didn't look at any other properties through a tendering process, Mr. Speaker, which would clear all this up. I've tabled the government's own purchasing policy. I've asked the Premier to explain how he ensured it was followed. He didn't answer, Mr. Speaker, and that's because they didn't follow it. They sidestepped it. Even though there's more than one property in this province that meets the needs of our healthcare system, but yet they picked this one without tender. So I'd like to ask the Premier directly, why did you sidestep your own purchasing policy?
Just like to remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition not to refer to members opposite directly. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to tell the honourable member we are excited about the fact that we get a chance to reshape the healthcare delivery model in our province. The fact that we get a chance to do the outpatient clinic that will move out in part of our capital city where a huge number of people are, a growing population are living there, those that would use that facility on a regular basis. At the same time, it's a great location for those of us who live outside to converge at the 103, the 102. Those are all positive signs. I also want to assure the honourable member that the good people of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal went out and looked at a number of sites. I think in total there were 15 sites. They narrowed it down to a couple of sites, gone through the negotiation with the number of landowners. This came up to be the one with the best value, the best deal, Mr. Speaker. Again, he stands in this House recognizing he's quoting a price that the person paid for forest land. He's not acknowledging in this House the fact that that site will require blasting. They'll need roads built in, water, sewer will have to be delivered into that, and everyone in this province knows the cost associated with that, Mr. Speaker, and we're looking forward to continue to work forward with all Nova Scotians so that we continue to improve the healthcare system that Nova Scotians want for not only for this decade, Mr. Speaker, but the next number of decades.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians will not be satisfied by a Premier who refuses to answer basic questions about why he ignored his own purchasing policy and didn't tender that purchase. In fact, every time the Premier stands up here and dodges the questions, they don't get more comfortable, Mr. Speaker. They get more suspicious that something fishy happened, because there is no good reason not to tender that land purchase, Mr. Speaker. Tendering would have cleared up all these questions. Not tendering leads to questions, Mr. Speaker. We've asked even basically, will the Premier break out the purchase price between the improvements on the land that he's citing in his answer here this afternoon and the actual purchase price, and his own government refuses to provide that information, Mr. Speaker. We've asked him to table every document related to this purchase. He says no. Share it with the Auditor General, and he says no. If it's such a good deal, Premier, why won't you show Nova Scotians all the details?
I'd like to remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition once more not to refer to members opposite directly. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's not what I said, Mr. Speaker. At any time the Auditor General has required information, Mr. Speaker, from our government, we've continued to provide him all of the information, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member has asked the Auditor General to come in. If the Auditor General thinks it's necessary, he'll do so, and we'll provide him with all of the information, Mr. Speaker, that he requires. We're very confident that we have best value for Nova Scotia taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to move forward. And there's one thing I'm certain, Mr. Speaker, one thing Nova Scotians are getting tired of is the negativity of the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, over the past 2 years, this government has cut more than $8 million from the budget of nursing homes. Nursing homes administrators have told this government that these cuts have reduced food quality and recreation programs for residents. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier apologize to Nova Scotians for taking money out of these facilities that house our most vulnerable seniors?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank, Mr. Speaker, all those Nova Scotians who work in nursing homes across our province and continue to make sure that our loved ones are cared for when they enter into those facilities. We made a decision a year ago to reduce by 1%. We believe that funding could have come out of administration in the nursing homes across the province. There were issues that were brought to our attention. The Minister of Health has continued to work with those nursing homes to deal with some of those issues, and I'm looking forward to the Minister of Finance standing up and tabling his budget in the coming days.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, residents in long-term care facilities need the care provided by the dedicated staff who work in these facilities. This government's $8 million cut has resulted in positions being left vacant and hours of work being reduced. Families of residents are worried about the impact of the quality of care. Mr. Speaker, can the Premier promise Nova Scotians that cutting budgets of nursing homes has not put seniors at risk?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the Honourable Member that the men and women across this province who work to ensure and care for our seniors are providing top quality care, Mr. Speaker, and I would put it up against not only care in this province but any province across the country, Mr. Speaker. I again want to tell the Honourable Member that there were nursing homes who after the budget of last year raised issues with the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health has sat down with each one of those nursing homes to work through those challenges. And again, I'm looking forward to the Minister of Finance standing up and tabling his budget tomorrow.
The Honourable Leader in the House of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow when this government tables their budget, it will be noted it will be nothing to be proud of. The people of Nova Scotia will not applaud this Premier. They will blame him for balancing the budget on the backs of seniors of this province. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier agree to restore the millions in funding he took from nursing homes that care for our most vulnerable seniors?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the work our government has done to continue to make sure that we continue to make the investments in home care, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that seniors who want to stay in their home as long as possible have the opportunity to stay there, Mr. Speaker, making sure that we're investing in classrooms across the province, making sure that we're investing in economic opportunities, Mr. Speaker, to provide job opportunities for young Nova Scotians here. We led the country on a per capita basis of retaining young people last year, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we did that by improving the fiscal health of this province that now is providing us with options that we didn't have when that gentleman was in Cabinet.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, for the past year, this government has told Nova Scotians the only way they can have safer highways is if they're prepared to pay a toll for that privilege, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the Minister of Transportation himself is quoted repeatedly as saying, and I'll quote from one example, it would be decades before the roads could be twinned unless Nova Scotians are prepared to pay a toll. Well, today, you know what, Mr. Speaker, we find out that that's not true. After all this kerfuffle, after all these studies, the expensive consultations that went on, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians saw through that and have said no to tolls, and suddenly now there's another way to get safer highways, Mr. Speaker. Why did the government spend all that time and money trying to tell people they needed to pay a toll to have safer highways when, in fact, there was always a better way?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he would know, we went out and consulted with Nova Scotians about the largest highway twinning project that would have been in our history, which had been a couple of 100 kilometres. We said we could do that through the process of tolling. Nova Scotians came to those meetings. Mr. Speaker, the minister went out, the people at TIR went out, they engaged them, they listened to them, we responded with them. We've now, Mr. Speaker, said to them, it was announced today, along working with the federal government, that we will be able to look at and work at 78 kilometres, Mr. Speaker, substantially less than the 200 kilometres we were talking about. We'll be moving forward on that, and I'm very grateful for those Nova Scotians who stood up and recognized and applauded our government for the work. And I want to thank the leader of the New Democratic Party, who recognizes these are good highway projects. Let's hope we can make it unanimous.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, let's call this what it is. This is a charade. This is a government that said it would be decades if you want safer roads, unless they could dig deeper into your pockets, Mr. Speaker. Now, on the eve of an election, suddenly it turns out the tolls aren't needed to cover off the most dangerous sections, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians saw through that charade, fortunately for them, because they're already digging deep enough into their pockets to pay the taxes and tolls that are imposed on them every day. Mr. Speaker, I've got to ask the Premier, why did he put Nova Scotians through this charade when there was money in Ottawa and infrastructure money available before he started to ask them for tolls? Why suddenly now is he changing his tune and finding that better way?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank, Mr. Speaker, all those Nova Scotians that came out and engaged the government when we were talking about tolling 200 kilometres of highway across the province. I want to thank the minister and the staff at TIR did a tremendous job. Mr. Speaker, very proud of the announcement today of the 78 kilometres that will be part of the 104, the 101, the 103, and the Burnside Connector, Mr. Speaker. Those were the important priorities that we were hearing from as we rode in those communities. We're going to continue to work with those communities to make those investments. I think it's also important for the honourable member to recognize part of the announcement today was part of that money, there's about $30 million that would also deal with areas where the highway is not being twinned, but we believe there's a safety issue that we continue to improve, like when you go below Digby in the Clare area, there's other places where we'll continue to work with that. But we heard very clearly from Nova Scotians, and I think the honourable member at one point stands up in this House and tells us to engage Nova Scotians, and then he's now complaining about the fact that we did, Mr. Speaker. So we're going to continue to work with Nova Scotians.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Speaker, my question is for the Premier. The Code Census report released by the NSGEU shines a light on his government's lack of attention to ERs in this province over the last 3.5 years. Patients' rooms being double, triple booked, patients flowing out into the hallways and family rooms. Meanwhile, this government has been busy creating a super board no one asked for, Mr. Speaker, a super board whose main purpose seems to be to relieve the minister from his responsibility as the head of the healthcare system. So I'd like to ask the Premier, as the leader of this province, when is he going to take some responsibility for overcrowding in ERs under his Liberal government?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question he raises. The Nova Scotia Government Employees Union, they worked with us, Mr. Speaker, to eliminate wait lists, Mr. Speaker, in home care. We're very proud of that. We want to thank them for the work. We've been working with them with a piece of legislation that will be introduced tomorrow. We're encouraged by that, and I want to ensure the honourable member that the report he's referring to will look at the recommendations and things that were brought forward by the union and by our employees. But I want to tell him and all Nova Scotians that when you enter into a healthcare system in our province, there are professional people working there. These are safe environments, Mr. Speaker, and people should feel they can go into these facilities and receive the top quality care that they've come to expect.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the snowball effect created by this government's inability to manage our healthcare system is putting lives of patients and staff at risk, Mr. Speaker. The lack of long-term care is backing up hospitals, which in turn are backing up ERs. The signs are all around us, Mr. Speaker, and yet it is the healthcare workers and patients' families, not the Minister of Health, not the government, who are having to come forward to bring these issues to the public attention. So I'd like to ask the Minister, or the Premier, so I ask the Premier, why hasn't he stepped in as leader of this province to put a stop to his government's neglect of the healthcare system, which is putting patients and healthcare workers at risk?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank the Minister of Health and the healthcare providers across the province who are working to ensure that when Nova Scotians require service, Mr. Speaker, is there for them. I want to remind the honourable member, it wasn't that long ago he was Minister of Health, and the QE2 issue that was on his desk got ignored and left there. We've been continuing to work. We're going to continue to work, Mr. Speaker. When we move
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
We want to continue to work, Mr. Speaker, as we improve the investment in our infrastructure. We know that when the 3rd and 4th floors being finished, the 5th floor in Dartmouth, the 8 OR theatres that will be created in Dartmouth will alleviate some of the pressure, Mr. Speaker, that's being felt downtown when we have cancelling taking place. The investment in home care, Mr. Speaker, is continuing to allow more seniors to receive the care at home where they want it as long as possible. And yes, we want to make sure we're going to continue to invest in long-term care facilities so that when a Nova Scotian senior requires that support, they will have it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, Nova Scotians heard the heartbreaking story of Jack Webb, a man who died at the QE2 in February. His story shows the chaos that goes on in our hospitals when people can't get the care that they need. Jack's story stirred many emotions, Mr. Speaker, in all of us and in all Nova Scotians who know we can be doing better than this. Quite frankly, they see this as proof that this government has let Jack Webb and his family and too many other Nova Scotians down. Would the Premier agree that the government has failed Jack Webb and his family just when he needed their care the most?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question again. As I said yesterday, I want to give my sympathies and condolences to the family. Mr. Speaker, every Nova Scotian, when they come into our healthcare system, we want to return that family back to their home. I want to also thank the healthcare providers who are working in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, providing top quality care. At the same time, there's been a level of neglect on infrastructure in this province for decades. We continue to work to make sure that we can alleviate some of that pressure. The honourable member stood up on his very first question complaining about the purchase price of a piece of land that will help alleviate some of the pressure that we're feeling down in the core on the peninsula. Complains about the fact that we are not quick enough to invest in Dartmouth when we're continuing to make investments. It's the first time in the history of this province that we continued on a parallel path to have multiple healthcare projects going on, Mr. Speaker, not waiting for one to finish because there's been a level of neglect for decades. And we're now making those investments, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to make sure that we deliver those services to Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, Jack Webb's family will take cold comfort from that answer where the Premier defends overpaying for land by $7.5 million, which came out of health care, which could have actually gone into providing the doctors and the services that Jack Webb needed when he needed a government that cared the most. And he didn't get it, Mr. Speaker, and it's happening far too often. In fact, we've been asking the Health Authority, how often do you call the code census in our hospitals? But you know what? They don't even track that anymore, Mr. Speaker, or if they do, they won't share it with the public. Well, the time has come to shine the light of day on the chaos going on in our hospitals. If the Premier wants Nova Scotia to know the truth, will he agree to ask the Health Authority to release the information we're all looking for? How often do our hospitals reach the point of crisis by calling a code census before the end of this week?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I completely disagree with the fact the healthcare system is in crisis, Mr. Speaker. Day in and day out, healthcare providers are caring for Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Continuing to provide, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Healthcare
Order,
providers.
please. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I disagree with the premise of the question, Mr. Speaker. The healthcare is not in crisis in this province, Mr. Speaker. Continuing to work with healthcare providers across the province, Mr. Speaker. We are handing out our sympathy and condolences to those families, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Webb's family. In no way was I equating what the price of land with. But, Mr. Speaker, there are certain things that should never be used for political purposes, Mr. Speaker, and this is one of them.
That's right. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier should tell Diane MacDonald there's no crisis in health care. Because, you know what, for her husband, for Reg Andrews, he watched his wife have a stroke 1 week after her doctor retired and has spent a year since then trying to find her a doctor to get the care that she needs without success, Mr. Speaker. To Reg, to Diane, there absolutely is a crisis in health care, and it starts with the lack of family doctors and the long waits that too many Nova Scotia families have to endure in order to get the care that they need, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier to tell Reg and Diane that he believes their problem is not a crisis in health care in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Reg and Diane, who ministers met with them a number of times. I met with them today, I believe it was. Minister of Health has met with them. We've worked with this family as we work with families across the province. We're continuing to bring in physicians, Mr. Speaker, in our province. At the same time, we're expanding the scope of practice, nurse practitioners, family practice nurses, and collaborative care centres. These are all positive changes that are coming. We know it's taken a long time for successive governments. They continue to try to deliver service. They didn't respond to the fact that healthcare workers wanted to work in a different environment. We've listened to healthcare workers, and that transition is taking a period of time, Mr. Speaker, but we're seeing very good results in communities across the province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is a Premier that promised a doctor for every Nova Scotian. Now it turns out, in order to get one, you have to actually have a meeting with the Minister of Health on the eve of an election, Mr. Speaker. Well, wouldn't it be better if we actually had access to doctors every day of every year and not just in the run-up to an election campaign, Mr. Speaker? Wouldn't it be better if they actually were out recruiting doctors today, instead of telling people that 5 or 10 years from now we might have a collaborative care centre for them when they actually need doctors now, Mr. Speaker? There is a crisis because there are too many people, like Reg's family, who are going without a family doctor, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we've asked the Health Authority, how many doctors have you recruited in the last 4 years? And you know what they told us? They told us, we'll have to get back to you on that a month ago, Mr. Speaker. This week in the legislature, will the Premier commit to tabling the actual recruitment numbers of doctors across Nova Scotia before the week is out?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank again those communities who out there who are working with government, continue to make sure we deal with the issues that have been neglected for decades in communities, who are grateful for that. I was very grateful to work with the municipality of Shelburne. We have 2 new doctors, a nurse practitioner, family practice nurse there. I was very pleased to be in New Waterford, talking and working with the members of that community who have come up with an innovative solution to healthcare, primary healthcare delivery. I'm grateful, looking forward to going down there and cutting a ribbon on a new facility. They've done a tremendous job. I'm looking forward. I was in Pugwash, the people of Pugwash, Mr. Speaker. All of those people were optimistic about the future of this province, and I'm going to continue to work with them to make sure that we continue to move our province forward.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, in August 2015, the Premier said he was opposed to a federal formula for health funding that did not take our province's aging population into account. In February of this year, the Premier said it would be difficult for any government to make changes to the funding formula. Mr. Speaker, it seems the Premier likes to take a hard line on bargaining here at home, but has a different approach to negotiating with his federal Liberal friends, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why did the Premier leave money on the table instead of fighting for the best deal for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. We were able to chance to negotiate with the federal government a 3% increase in health care spending from the federal government. We have a substantial amount of money on the table to deliver home care that will add on top of the delivery of home care that we're doing now, which Nova Scotians is a priority of Nova Scotians. As well, there's a tremendous amount of money there for adolescent mental health. That money will start coming in. That money will be directly invested in ensuring we're providing those services and care that Nova Scotians require. We're going to continue to work with the national government. We'll continue to represent the interests of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to stand up for Nova Scotians. And, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to treat our employees fairly with a wage increase, Mr. Speaker, that we can afford.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
That's not what he told Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. He said Nova Scotians' aging demographic had to be taken into account, Mr. Speaker, and it wasn't. On December 23rd, the government announced it had reached a deal with the federal government. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, in public accounts, we heard from the Deputy Minister of Finance and Treasury Board that the government did not, in fact, have an agreement and that a per capita funding formula will hurt provinces like Nova Scotia. So I'd like to ask the Minister, does the Premier agree with the Deputy Minister of Finance that the deal or whatever was signed in December will hurt our province's ability to provide health care to our aging population?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the honourable member, there's a specific targeted funding for home care, which will be directly towards seniors to deliver investment. We have a 3% increase on the total envelope coming from the national government. That money will be directly into helping all Nova Scotians to access primary health care. The big priority of our government and Nova Scotians is adolescent mental health. We know there's targeted money specifically that will go into adolescent mental health. Again, I'm looking forward to the Minister of Health tabling his budget tomorrow, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Today, Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal again promised to move ahead on the Burnside Expressway, but that promise, of course, has been recycled for 28 years. This time, TAR didn't even bother to include the Greater Burnside Business Association as a stakeholder in the stakeholder sessions, instead issuing an apology to them through the department's Brian Ward in March for missing them, and I will table that. Now there is a new possible start in 2018. The last time government promised to start the project in a year, all we got was a sign. So what can the Premier offer to prove that this new commitment is nothing more than a new sign like last time?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I want to thank the people of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, the Minister, who've gone out and engaged Nova Scotians. We know the importance of this connector. We've gone through. There's been a number of pieces of parcels of land that we had to get access to. We have access to that. We made a commitment, Mr. Speaker, and we'll follow through on that commitment. All 4 of those projects and begin to move forward within the next 7-year timeline. They will be completed, and I was very pleased to hear the way they've been received in those communities in a positive way. It's unfortunate when the honourable member crossed the floor, he's become as negative as everyone else on that side.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in September 2010, the now Premier was quoted in the Burnside News, and I'll table this, as saying the completion of the expressway would be a top priority for a Liberal government. That was in 2010. In the previous NDP government, and I will table this, said the project would be completed by 2012. It wasn't. Now today we hear the project will be at least 7 years after a possible start, which is over a year away. Can the Premier explain how this project is a priority if it is now so far from completion, no construction or clearing has begun, the $17.5 million originally allocated and announced by the feds has expired because of delays, and there is nothing new since the sign went up under the previous government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I'll go back to the fact we now have access to that entire property. We have made a commitment. With dollars and capital spend. We're going to continue to move that process along. We've demonstrated it every time that we've made investment in important infrastructure in this province that we do these in parallel. We continue to stage gate them, Mr. Speaker. We'll move forward on that project, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to make it there, and we will know that we'll continue to work with communities across this province to improve not only the infrastructure in those communities but the economy of this province.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Premier as well. I stand in awe today, Mr. Speaker, in awe of a Premier of this province that can stand in this House and tell people there is no crisis in health care. I can't even believe that. I can't wait to see Hampton to make sure that what I heard is correct. I have here, Mr. Speaker, a note from a doctor in our area. Medical care has deteriorated in Cape Breton over the past 2 years. We have lost a critical number of specialists, and our mental health service is in crisis. And that's signed by Dr. Jeannie Ferguson. Now, Mr. Premier, you say that things have been neglected for years. You're at the helm. Your minister
Order,
said...
please. I'd like to remind the honourable member not to speak directly to members opposite. And do you have a question?
I certainly do. Thank you very much for putting me on the right track, Mr. Speaker.
You're welcome.
Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, how can he stand here and tell the people of Cape Breton Island there's no crisis when they have no family doctors, they have no specialists, they have no psychologists? What can this Premier tell the people of Nova Scotia about his plan for health care?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We continue to work with healthcare providers across the province, Mr. Speaker, making sure that those communities that are underserviced will have access to primary health care. We continue to make investments in doctors, nurse practitioners, family practice nurses. Mr. Speaker, we're seeing positive changes in communities. In some communities, that change is not happening as quickly as we would like and as quickly as the communities would like. But we're going to continue to still work with them and partner with them to make sure that they have access to that primary health care, Mr. Speaker, that every Nova Scotian should have in their communities where they live.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you will be to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, Cape Breton has lost a number of specialists. We have no vascular surgery. We have no thoracic surgery. We have no infectious control doctor. We haven't any physical medicine doctor. There are 2 geriatricians that left, and a number of psychiatrists have left as well. Mr. Speaker, all these people were in place when this government took over. Can the Minister of Health tell the people of Cape Breton Island how they're supposed to access these specialists when they, under his watch, have left because of the disrespect paid to them by this government?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member.
It went to the Minister.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. As the member opposite well knows, those positions, in fact, have been posted to have doctors fill those who have retired. Some have, some have left the area. But what I know, Mr. Speaker, is that in fact we have recruited for Cape Breton over the past 3 years. I should say, really, I need to correct that. The Nova Scotia Health Authority has recruited for Cape Breton over the last number of years, and in fact, yes, there in fact can be a few specialist positions, whether it's the IWK, the Halifax Infirmary, Cape Breton Regional, from time to time. But what I know is that aggressive recruitment has been going on.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, my question is also to the Minister of Health. The actions of the Minister of Health and this government has caused fear, frustration and uncertainty among the people that depend on the Northside General Hospital. Rumours are swirling throughout the community that this government plans to close the hospital. With so many people without family doctors, the Northside General is their only option for frontline health care. So my question to the ministers, will the Minister of Health put an end to this rumours once and for all and reveal his plan for the Northside General today?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can tell the member opposite is that, yes, while there is some work going on in terms of planning, today I can stand in my place and say with confidence that there isn't a plan for any closure at Northside. It plays an extremely important role in the community, and in fact, if the member opposite could actually get in his place and he can list some of the services that have helped repurpose Northside as services moved over to Cape Breton Regional Hospital some years ago. And in fact, all governments have committed to keeping Northside viable for now and for the future.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, the plan, I think, is to repurpose the emergency room. By cutting the wages of emergency room doctors at the Northside General, the Minister of Health has fueled rumours that plans to starve out the hospital and close it. His irresponsible actions have increased the anxiety of thousands of residents in need of primary health care. There is also a call to have a hospitalist within the hospital to deliver primary care for patients who are inpatients. So my question is to the Minister, will the Minister end the speculation with the Northside General by reversing this wage cut to the ER doctors and commit in writing to keep the Northside General emergency room and the hospital open?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for an important question. In terms of a hospitalist looking after patients in hospital, that's a standard of care. In fact, right across Canada, that's nothing new, nothing different. We know that that's an important role to have that consistency of care while the patient is in hospital. I know the member opposite asked the question on the basis of information that may have been misconstrued, misunderstood from last night's meeting. But what I can tell the member opposite and all the good residents of his riding and neighbouring communities, there will be no change in the pay schedule of the emergency room doctors at Northside.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, a 2014 evaluation of collaborative emergency centres found that CECs provide patients with better access to primary health care services. They decrease emergency room closures, and that CEC patients are far more likely to have access to the right provider at the right time in the right place than they did before the CECs were introduced. In Public Accounts Committee this morning, Doctors Nova Scotia said they saw how CECs brought stability to access to emergency care in rural communities. We know the model works, but this government has been more focused on amalgamation than addressing the growing crisis in our emergency centres. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Health why this government hasn't been able to open one single collaborative emergency centre.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that that model has brought positive results to some of those communities, but in many ways it is a primary care model. It is not emergency care. There is some urgent care looked after when the paramedic is on duty during the overnight period, but there are other models of care and team-based practice that incorporates mental health care, dietary, and a number of other specialists that move in and out of the collaborative practice has in fact proved to be a strong way of delivering care that in fact keeps people out of emergency in the first place.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, that certainly does not address it when you have an emergency. To talk about preventative instead of talking about those who have an emergency. That's what we're talking about. Mr. Speaker, we opened the NDP, the first collaborative emergency centre, and it reduced ER closures 4 years in a row. In 2014, the minister said that the CEC in Lunenburg would have a definite date very shortly. In 2015, the minister said that CECs would be coming to North Sydney, Lunenburg, Glace Bay, and New Waterford. In 2016, the minister said a health services review would determine where communities would CECs. Mr. Speaker, they've had more than 3 years, and we have seen no progress and the same excuse over and over and over again. So, Mr. Speaker, why has the minister spent 3 years rearranging bureaucrats instead of making sure Nova Scotians have access to emergency centres?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have toured all of the CECs in the province. They are there for the purpose of primary care and urgent care, not emergency care. Those communities, when they have an emergency, they call 911. They called for the paramedics to take them to one of the regional hospitals. And in fact, we have opened a collaborative care centre in Guysborough. We have stabilized Lunenburg. They like the fact that they have top-rate emergency service through the day and into the evening, and that suits those residents because they know just down the road in Bridgewater they have an outstanding emergency care service in that hospital.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. Yesterday, when the Minister of Natural Resources was under fire for what the Ombudsman characterized as indulgent and opportunistic spending, the Premier came to his defence. The former warden charged thousands of dollars in personal expenses to the municipal credit card and what amounted to a number of short-term loans from the taxpayers. My question is, will the Premier direct the Minister to apologize to the taxpayers of Guysborough County for spending their money?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank the Minister of Municipal Services. Mr. Speaker, he tabled a bill today to deal with issues that were brought to government's attention by the Ombudsman's report, not only deal with the municipality of Guysborough, municipal units across the province. We continue to work with them. And I do want to acknowledge the member from Guysborough for not only for his time in working as a member of the Executive Council, being elected to this House, but for his 25 years of service at the municipal level, Mr. Speaker, continuing to work with the good people of Guysborough to move that county forward, Mr. Speaker. They're ones that seeing positive economic development, economic opportunities for the citizens that are riding. Mr. Speaker, the people of Guysborough will determine that member's fate whether or not he comes back to this House or not.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Despite the embarrassing revelations made about his spending habits in the Ombudsman's report, the Minister of Natural Resources declared that he is actually very pleased with the report. Even the Premier is watching what he has to say on this one. In fact, the Premier said yesterday, and I quote, "Minister Hines, since he has been working in our government, there has been no inappropriate spending," the operative word being since. My question is, does the Premier actually believe that the ethical standard for ministers is simply don't do anything inappropriate in my cabinet?
The Honourable Premier.
That's a good starting point, Mr. Speaker. But I would also want to tell the honourable member what the Ombudsman said, Mr. Speaker, that the honourable member did nothing wrong, Mr. Speaker. What the Ombudsman said was there was issues, Mr. Speaker. What the honourable member said, there were issues around the municipal table across Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And what the good member from Yarmouth, who's the Minister of Municipal Services, take action, Mr. Speaker, and he tabled a bill today that I hope the honourable member will support.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Internal Services, because it turns out that it is the Minister of Internal Services who is responsible for enforcement of the government's purchasing policy. Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotians have seen a government that paid 12 times the assessed value for the Whopper Drop lands, and they hear the Premier saying that that was the best value. We'll never know because it wasn't tendered, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Nova Scotians are wondering if they already own land, maybe by another level of government, that could have been used and saved the $7.5 million for something else in healthcare, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister responsible for the purchasing policy if he can tell the House if any proposals were received or any discussions happened between either the Government of Canada or the Halifax regional municipalities about available lands that they had that could have been used for this purpose.
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question. In this process, we did follow all procurement practices. In all of our acquisitions, Mr. Speaker, we don't have to RFP for every purchase that government makes. There's other ways government purchases. There's direct negotiations. And in this instance, Mr. Speaker, we provided the best value for taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition keeps misleading Nova Scotians, trying to compare the value of buying woodlots to what the developer has to incur, which is blasting the bedrock, which is running services. He has to run water. He has to run sewage. He has to run electricity in there. HRM put out a notice that the cost of that can be $300,000 to $500,000. Mr. Speaker, I think the taxpayer got a great deal on that land.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the only person misleading Nova Scotians is the Minister of Internal Services right now.
Order, please. Order, please. Just like to remind the honourable member to infer that the honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Internal Services is following his Premier's lead in not answering the question. I asked him if there had been any discussions or proposals from another level of government that has land that the taxpayers already own that could have been used. He didn't answer that question, Mr. Speaker, leading to more concern that there's something fishy going on here. He's responsible for getting a good deal for taxpayers. He won't even answer the basic question, did he or his officials talk to HRM or the Government of Canada about land that they already own? So I'm going to ask him, Mr. Speaker, two things. One, table any discussion. Answer the question, first of all, did you or not? And secondly, did he also or his officials have any discussion with the sole source provider of that land, which is the developer? And if so, table the times and dates and content of those meetings so he can show for himself what he did to enforce this policy.
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have a correction. Maybe if opposition would stop heckling, they could hear the answer. Mr. Speaker, sole source implies that only one person was consulted. That's not what happened here. We spoke with over 10 landowners, Mr. Speaker. And I would also like to add that we negotiated heavily down to 2 sites, and the best site was chosen for the taxpayer in Nova Scotia. Leader of the Opposition wants to talk about savings. Well, Mr. Speaker, yesterday I tabled a report that amounted to $50 million of procurement savings for the taxpayer of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, in that report, there was over $20 million of savings in health care alone.
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
In that report, there was over $20 million of savings in health care alone. Mr. Speaker, in final, I'd like to point out comparables in Bears Lake. The land we bought was the cheapest land for the amount of land we bought. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, 3.5 years ago, the Premier told voters he would ensure there was a doctor for every Nova Scotian. Today, there are still over 100,000 people without a family doctor. The Premier has focused on rearranging the health authorities instead of focusing on the promise that he made to Nova Scotians. So, on the eve of an election, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, will the Premier apologize to Nova Scotians for his failure and the Liberal government's failure to meet his promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We continue to announce that it was in Shelburne this week, announced 2 doctors, family practice nurse practitioner. We are getting providing an opportunity for nurse practitioners to practice to full scope, bringing in family practice nurse, bringing in all healthcare providers in a team to make sure that Nova Scotia across the province have access to primary health care. We know, Mr. Speaker, that our communities are still without some access to that primary care. That's why we're continuing to work with our partners to make sure that we have those health care providers in the communities across this province, and we'll continue to do so.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's cold comfort to those who don't have a doctor here today that took the Premier at his word. Today at Public Accounts, we heard from Doctors Nova Scotia that said the doctor shortage in our province is more pronounced now than it ever has been. We know that there are 118 physician vacancies. They're indicating we need to recruit over 100 new doctors every year for the next 10 years. And, Mr. Speaker, this government introduced a tuition rebate program for 25 doctors per year that would hopefully contribute to attracting doctors, but they haven't fulfilled the utilization of that program, Mr. Speaker. This government has no plan. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why has the Premier spent 3 years, 3.5 years, Mr. Speaker, sitting on his hands just hoping doctors will come to Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, when he was Minister of Health, the neglect that the Department and delivery of health care suffered was a tough order to overcome. We had 9 different fractured systems across the province. We came in, there was no HR plan at all. There was no idea when doctors were retiring, where nurses were retiring, Mr. Speaker. We ended up coming in, putting together a plan, Mr. Speaker. We've seen this come forward. We've worked with healthcare providers. We respect the role of the nurse practitioner, respect the role of family practice nurses. We've brought them together to provide primary health care in communities across the province. We know there's more work to do, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with our healthcare providers. We're going to work with those communities, Mr. Speaker, who've come to the table with solutions, Mr. Speaker. We've seen that in Shelburne. We're seeing that in Pugwash. We're seeing that in other communities in Waterford. We're seeing where communities are coming together, Mr. Speaker. They're getting tired of the negativity coming from the other side of their house, and they're joining to work with government to deliver services to Nova Scotians.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to opposition business. The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you call Bill 21, the Health Authority Act?
We'll now call Bill number 21, the Health Authority Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to be able to stand for a few moments to discuss this piece of legislation. I think it's extremely timely that we recognize the need to try to improve and change the course that the current government is taking, Mr. Speaker, and is taking our healthcare system. Over the last 3.5 years, we've watched the government sit on their hands instead of making health care a priority, Mr. Speaker. What they wanted to do was amalgamate the district health authorities, and they spent a lot of time and energy doing that, Mr. Speaker. And what has happened, as we've seen day after day after day, more and more people going to the media, trying to get the attention of the government, that the direction they've taken over the last 3.5 years has not improved health care delivery.